The room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making every small noise like the soft tick of the clock or the distant creak of the floorboards feel impossibly loud. The walls, painted a faded cream, seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the hum of your own breathing and heartbeat. The curtains, old and thick, hung heavily over the window, blocking the pale glow of the streetlights outside. By day, they seemed ordinary, just pieces of fabric keeping sunlight at bay. But at night, they became something else entirely. They looked denser, more opaque, almost as if they had weight beyond their material. Shadows pooled in the folds like dark water, shifting subtly, teasing the edges of perception. I could feel the air in the room changing as the night deepened. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence. It pressed in on my senses, making the smallest details impossible to ignore. The faint smell of old wood and dust lingered, grounding me in reality while the mind began to wander. Each creak of the floorboards, each soft sigh of wind to the trees outside, seemed amplified in this stillness. I told myself it was all normal, that old houses make noises and the wind is never truly silent. But even as I reasoned, a tiny unease began to settle in my chest. I shifted slightly on the bed, trying to find comfort in the familiar, but my eyes kept drifting toward the curtain. Something about it made me hesitate, a subtle hesitation I couldn't quite name. Was it just the way the fabric hung, or was there something else? My imagination whispered explanations, drafts, shadows, the trick of moonlight hitting the folds at the right angle. Yet no matter how much I rationalized, a small part of me resisted looking directly at it. My chest tightened, and I felt the beginnings of that deep, crawling awareness that the room was not entirely empty. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, tried to count my breaths to calm the restless thoughts racing in my mind. The house had been mine for years, yet each night still felt unfamiliar, as if it were slowly learning my routines and waiting for moments of weakness. Every creak of the floorboard sounded deliberate, each distant drip of water from the pipes sharper than the last, as if the house itself were speaking in subtle, indecipherable language. The air felt heavier here, almost tangible, settling on my skin like a soft, oppressive weight. Somewhere far away, the wind whispered through the trees outside, rustling branches against the window pane. But the curtains didn't sway. They remained perfectly still, almost defiant, holding the darkness behind them like a secret they were unwilling to share. I shifted slightly, trying to ignore the creeping sense of awareness pressing against my mind. I told myself repeatedly that it was my imagination. Old houses make noises. Curtains shift. Shadows move. Shadows are not alive. Yet, despite my rational thoughts, the sensation persisted. It felt as though the room itself were breathing, inhaling and exhaling with me, or perhaps watching me as I lay there. Every tiny movement, the tick of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, suddenly seemed amplified, drawing my attention toward the heavy drapery at the edge of the room. My heart beat a little faster each time, a subtle drum reminding me that perhaps I was not entirely alone. I closed my eyes briefly, attempting to drift into sleep, but even in the darkness behind my eyelids, the feeling remained. The stillness of the curtain, the weight of the silence, the almost imperceptible pressure in the room. It all conspired to keep my mind alert. I imagined shadows shifting behind the fabric. Just out of sight, waiting for me to look, the uncertainty was worse than certainty. I didn't know if I was truly being watched, but my body responded as though I was. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to create a sense of safety, yet the awareness persisted, curling in my chest like a quiet, insistent whisper I could not escape. There was always that small, nagging hesitation whenever my eyes drifted toward the curtain. I told myself it was nothing, just the way the fabric hung, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. Yet my body reacted before my thoughts could catch up. A subtle tightening in my chest, a shallow hitch in my breathing. I tried to reason it away. Old houses creak. Curtains move with drafts. Shadows shift as the moonlight changes angle. All perfectly logical. But deep down, I knew logic was only half the story. Something about the darkness behind those folds seemed alive, not in a way of moving objects or sounds, but in a way that felt aware. I focused on the ceiling, counting my breaths again, trying to will my imagination into submission. The methodical rhythm was supposed to calm me, but instead, it heightened my awareness of every minute detail. The ticking of the clock, the soft hum of distant traffic outside, the faint squeak of the walls settling. It all seemed amplified in the quiet of the room. Every tiny sound pulled me back to that curtain, that unblinking, silent presence. Even though I couldn't see anything, the more I tried to look away, the more insistent the awareness became, like a gentle, pressing weight urging me to acknowledge it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized I was holding my breath without noticing. I forced myself to relax, to release the tension in my shoulders, but my mind refused to let go. The curtain, still and heavy, became a symbol of the unknown, a boundary between the safety of my room and something just beyond comprehension. My imagination conjured impossible shapes, a shadow flickering, a pair of eyes peeking from behind, a hand brushing lightly across the fabric. None of it moved, yet the suggestion of movement was enough to make the hair on my arms stand on end. Even as I lay there, attempting to convince myself it was all imagination, a faint awareness lingered, not a presence that made noise or moved objects, just the tension. Something that didn't need to move to be there, something that could simply exist and still make its presence felt. I told myself that I was imagining it. I repeated it over and over, like a mantra, but the tightening in my chest and the unshakable feeling in the room told me otherwise. The curtain remained motionless, but I couldn't shake the sense that it was waiting for me to look, waiting for me to notice. Sometimes, just before sleep began to take me, I could feel it, a subtle pressure in the air that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't a sound nor a movement. It was something far more intangible, more insidious. It was awareness, a presence that didn't announce itself but made itself known, pressing lightly against the edges of my mind. My chest tightened in response, a nervous rhythm echoing the faint pulse I felt in the room. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of fatigue and isolation, yet the sensation refused to fade. It lingered, a quiet insistence, as if the room itself were conscious of my every breath. The darkness behind the curtain seemed to thicken at that moment. Shadows pooled in the folds, dark and shapeless, yet my mind couldn't help but see patterns. Fleeting glimpses of movement, subtle curves that hinted at something watching, waiting. I forced my eyes to look elsewhere, to the ceiling, the wall, anywhere but the curtain, but the sense of attention followed me. It pressed against my awareness, curling into the corners of my mind like a soft, cold tendril. I imagined the curtain breathing ever so slightly, as if it had lungs of its own, inhaling and exhaling in tandem with my own slow breaths. Even as I clutched the blanket tighter, tried to summon a sense of safety, the pressure didn't relent. It was patient, silent, unmoving, yet it existed in a way that made every instinct in my body scream caution. I imagined eyes behind the folds, just enough to spark a sense of recognition without giving form. Eyes that didn't blink, that didn't move, but simply observed, consuming the quiet and turning it into a kind of living awareness. My rational mind argued that this was impossible, that the curtains were just fabric and shadows, yet my body betrayed me. Every nerve was alive, every tiny hair standing on end, as though confirming the truth I refused to acknowledge. The awareness lingered long after I closed my eyes, when I should have been drifting into the shallow safety of sleep. Even in darkness, the sensation persisted, a subtle reminder that something beyond my comprehension existed in the room. It didn't rush, it didn't demand, it simply waited, patient, watchful, eternal. And in that waiting, the weight of the unknown pressed on me, soft but unyielding, until I wondered whether sleep itself was an invitation to something I could not yet see. The curtain remained still, but its stillness spoke louder than any movement ever could. I was not alone. And then, as I finally felt my eyelids growing heavy, the thought settled into the deepest part of my mind. Silence can be comforting or it can be watching. The curtains remained closed, thick and dark, untouched by even the slightest breeze. Yet in their stillness, I could feel something beyond understanding, a presence that did not need to move to exist, that could simply observe while I lay helplessly aware of every small sound my own body made. My breathing became slow, deliberate, each inhale and exhale measured, as if the rhythm itself could convince whatever was behind the curtain that I was safe. But safety was an illusion. I felt the quiet pressure pressing in, subtle but undeniable. I imagined the shadows pooling in the folds of the fabric, stretching and twisting into forms my mind could not name. They didn't shift or move. They merely were. And yet, that existence was enough. My imagination, usually my ally in the dim safety of my room, began to betray me, turning the darkness into shapes that might blink, might stare, might follow me if I looked. I could almost see a faint gleam behind the thick folds, a hint of eyes reflecting nothing yet everything, watching patiently, silently. I tried to tell myself it was impossible. Old houses hold creaks, wind rustles the trees, shadows stretch in the moonlight, all logical explanations. And yet, they did nothing to soothe the growing awareness in my chest. Every sound in the room seemed amplified in the heavy quiet. The sough from the refrigerator from the kitchen, the faint tick of the clock, even the gentle whisper of the wind brushing past the window outside. Each sound reminded me of my own presence, my own vulnerability, and the contrast made the stillness of the curtain feel more alive. I could sense that whatever lay behind it was patient, not needing to rush, not needing to reveal itself. And in that patience, there was a power far greater than motion or noise could ever convey. It simply waited, letting the mind of the observer, the me lying in bed, do all the work, imagining shapes, creating fears, feeling every heartbeat echo like a drum against the walls. I tried to relax, pulling the blanket closer, curling slightly into a protective position, attempting to surrender to sleep. But the sensation didn't leave. It hovered at the edges of my awareness, a soft, pressing insistence that whispered, without words, that it knew I was awake. I imagined a pair of eyes behind the folds, unblinking, patient, and utterly indifferent to my attempts at reasoning. Each time my mind tried to rationalize it away, the sensation tightened again, a quiet reminder that reason and logic meant nothing to whatever was there. The room felt alive in its own secret way, breathing along with me, coiling around the silence, filling the spaces between my thoughts with an unsettling stillness. And so I lay there, drifting slowly into the blurred line between wakefulness and sleep, aware, always aware of the silent gaze. The curtain remained motionless, but its stillness became a language of its own. I could feel it, almost like a faint weight pressing on the edge of my consciousness, telling me that watching was enough. That was all it needed. My eyes fluttered shut, but even behind the lids, the awareness lingered. Sleep arrived reluctantly, an uneasy companion, as the curtain held its vigil, patient, silent, eternal. Even as sleep finally began to tug at my consciousness, a lingering unease remained, subtle but persistent, crawling along the edges of my awareness. My body felt heavy, each limb sinking into the mattress, yet my mind refused to let go entirely. The curtain, silent and unyielding, seemed to thicken in the darkness, drawing my thoughts toward it even when I tried desperately to look away. The folds appeared deeper than they should, shadows stretching into impossible shapes that my rational mind struggled to dismiss. And still there was no sound, no movement, only the weight of its presence, silent, patient, and absolute. I told myself repeatedly that I was imagining it, that it was just fatigue, just the mind exaggerating shapes in the darkness. But the more I tried to convince myself, the stronger the awareness felt. It pressed gently, insistently, like a living thing, curling around the edges of my perception. I felt it behind the curtain, not moving, not breathing audibly, yet undeniably aware. Every tiny noise in the room, the faint ticking of the clock, the soft hum of distant traffic, even the whisper of the wind outside, seemed to remind me of its patience, its quiet omnipresence. I began to notice the subtle temperature change, a barely perceptible coolness that lingered near the curtain, as if the air itself were denser, heavier, and aware of my presence. In the darkness, my imagination began to construct impossible forms. Shadows stretched unnaturally, pooling into shapes that were not fully realized, yet hinted at some unknown observer. I could almost sense eyes, too many to count, blinking faintly, watching not with hostility but with patient intent. I resisted the urge to look directly at the curtain, fearing that doing so might somehow confirm their existence. Yet the pressure of attention remained, curling in my chest, tightening with every shallow breath, and refusing to release me. The line between what was real and what was imagined blurred with each passing minute. As the quiet awareness persisted without change, I shifted slightly under the blanket, attempting to soothe the rising tension. Yet the awareness did not leave. It lingered, occupying the still spaces of the room, infusing the darkness with an invisible presence that I could feel but could not name. My thoughts circled, imagining all the ways I might be wrong. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps I was dreaming. Perhaps the shadows were merely shapes. And yet, deep in my gut, I knew that the stillness of the curtain was not empty. Something existed there, patient, silent, and indifferent to my attempts at logic. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, each second lingering, each breath drawn with deliberate slowness. The curtain became more than fabric. It was a threshold, a barrier between what I could perceive and what I could not. My mind conjured fleeting images of shapes that blinked, watching from behind, their presence suggested by subtle shifts in the darkness, the almost imperceptible pressure that lingered near the edges of my awareness. I could feel them in my chest, a quiet weight pressing down, reminding me that sleep was not complete surrender. It was merely a temporary distraction from the patient eyes that waited. Finally, as my mind hovered on the edge of consciousness, the awareness did not dissipate, but became a part of the quiet rhythm of the room. The ticking of the clock, the faint hum outside, the soft creaks of the house settling, all blended into a lullaby of unease. The curtain remained unmoving, yet the awareness it held stretched through every corner of the room, filling the darkness with patient observation. And as I drifted fully into sleep, the knowledge remained with me. Something behind the curtain was there, always watching, always waiting, silent, eternal, and utterly indifferent to my presence. The next night, the room felt heavier than before. The quiet was thicker, almost tangible, pressing against my skin and settling into my bones. The curtains hung the same as always, dark and unmoving, yet they seemed to occupy more space in my mind, more presence than their fabric should allow. I lay on the bed, feeling the familiar weight of the blanket, but it no longer offered comfort. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper wind outside, felt amplified, as if the house itself were listening along with me. The stillness of the night was no longer a blank canvas for sleep. It had become an actor in the quiet play of my growing unease. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of the previous night's awareness twisting my perception. But as I stared at the ceiling, counting my breaths in the same slow rhythm I had the night before, the sensation was undeniable. It was a quiet insistence, patient, calm, yet impossible to ignore. The curtain, unmoved by air or gravity, seemed heavier than its physical form, more purposeful. Shadows pooled in its folds like liquid darkness, subtle and shapeless, yet somehow commanding attention. I could feel the room breathing with me, or perhaps at me, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the pulse in my chest. I focused on each sound, each tiny vibration in the room, cataloging them in my mind, convinced myself they were harmless. The distant hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, even the faint rustle of leaves outside. It all seemed to echo slightly in the darkness, magnifying the awareness I felt pressing from behind the curtain. My thoughts tried to rationalize, trying to anchor me in logic. Curtains don't breathe, shadows don't watch, silence is not alive. Yet my body betrayed me. Each nerve, each muscle, felt a subtle tension, a readiness to respond to something unseen. My eyes darted toward the folds more than once, only to jerk away, unwilling to confront the stillness that seemed so full of attention. Even as I attempted to drift into sleep, the awareness persisted. It was patient, as if it had all the time in the world. I could imagine it observing me with infinite patience, waiting for a slip, a careless glance, a soft exhale. The silence around me was not empty. It carried weight, filled with unseen presence. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice whispered, "You are not alone." The curtain remained closed, unmoving, yet it loomed large in the room itself, a dark, unblinking sentinel. I lay there, tried to relax, but knowing deep down that the quiet was never empty, that the stillness was not passive, that it waited. Finally, I surrendered to the uneasy rhythm, allowing my breathing to match the slow, oppressive beat of the room. Sleep came reluctantly, folding me into its temporary relief, yet the awareness lingered even as my eyelids drifted shut. The curtain's presence stretched into the corners of my mind, patient, silent, eternal. And as darkness consumed my vision, I felt it watching still, always watching, waiting for the next breath, the next movement, the next moment of vulnerability. The night deepened, and with it, the weight of the room seemed to grow heavier. Every shadow appeared darker, every corner more secretive, and the silence became almost suffocating. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed, that the room was the same as always, and yet it wasn't. The curtain hung motionless, yet it carried a presence I could feel pressing against my awareness. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the mind, but the body noticed. My chest felt tight, and each breath seemed slightly heavier, as if the air itself had become denser. I tried to occupy my mind, counting each heartbeat, naming every sound in the room. The tick of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional distant rumble of traffic outside. Each repetition was supposed to soothe, to calm the unease, but instead, it amplified the awareness I felt behind the curtain. Shadows pooled in the folds, shifting just at the edges of perception, never fully forming, but enough to make my imagination fill in the gaps. I imagined eyes blinking slowly, watching, waiting, calculating. I told myself it was just fatigue, just my mind exaggerating shapes in the darkness. Yet, despite my reasoning, the subtle pressure continued, patient and unyielding. The more I tried to focus on something else, the stronger the awareness seemed to grow. I noticed the faintest of movements in the curtain, the way a shadow stretched slightly as though reaching beyond its fabric. Though I could not see anything real, my muscles tensed with each flicker of imagination, my heart echoing the quiet rhythm of anticipation. I thought about looking directly at the curtain, but something held me back, an instinctive fear that acknowledgement would change whatever was there. The room was not empty. Something existed, patient and still, drawing energy from the silence itself, feeding on my awareness. I shifted under the blanket, curling slightly as if protection could shield me from the invisible observer. Yet even that small movement did nothing to dissipate the tension. It remained, a quiet companion in the darkness, guiding my imagination and thoughts into a careful, measured fear. I imagined a pair of eyes, unblinking and patient, observing me without need for movement. The stillness of the curtain gave them power. Motion was unnecessary. And in the quiet, I felt the room expand, stretching to contain more than just furniture, walls, and floorboards. It seemed to hold something sentient, watching, aware, and waiting. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. My eyelids drooped, my body grew heavy, yet my mind could not fully rest. The curtain loomed at the edge of vision, its weight and darkness pressing into consciousness. I realized that the true terror was not in seeing movement, but in knowing the unseen could be present without sound or motion. It was patient, eternal, and utterly indifferent. And as I finally slipped into the shallow haze of sleep, I carried with me the undeniable knowledge that behind the curtain, something remained, silent, vigilant, and always watching. By the middle of the night, the quiet had taken on a life of its own. The room felt denser, heavier, as if the very air carried awareness. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind refusing to let go of the curtain at the far end of the room. Its dark folds seemed thicker tonight, almost tangible, as if they could reach out and touch me if I were careless. Shadows pooled within them, shifting in ways that no rational mind could explain, subtle and fleeting, appearing only when I dared to glance toward them. I forced my eyes elsewhere, trying to focus on the muted hum of the refrigerator or the distant traffic outside, but the awareness lingered, pressing in quietly, insistently. I told myself it was nothing, just imagination, fatigue, or the play of shadows, but my body refused to agree. My chest tightened, my muscles held tension I couldn't release, and a subtle tremor ran through my hands as I lay still, pretending to rest. Each heartbeat seemed louder than the last, echoing through the silence like a signal that I was not alone. The curtain remained motionless, yet was more alive than any sound, any movement could ever make it. There was intention in its stillness, a patience that unnerved me more than any sudden scare ever could. I could feel it observing me, waiting for a slip, a twitch, any small sign that I acknowledged it. The shadows of the edges of the folds seemed to pool and stretch, forming shapes that my mind could not fully name. I imagined eyes, too many to count, blinking slowly, following me in their patient, silent manner. They didn't need to move to be aware. Their stillness carried weight. My imagination ran wild, conjuring subtle, impossible forms that seemed to exist just out of sight, waiting to reveal themselves only if I dared to look. Every sound in the room, no matter how small, the ticking clock, the faint creak of the floorboards, even the subtle sighs of the house settling, amplified the feeling that I was not alone. The silence was not empty. It was full of attention. I shifted slightly under the blanket, curling in a futile attempt at comfort. The awareness didn't waver. It remained patient, observing, as though the very act of lying awake fed it. My eyes darted toward the curtain more than once, each glance a battle between curiosity and fear. Even when I forced myself to look away, the sensation followed, coiling at the edges of my mind like a living shadow. The more I tried to distract myself, the more the presence seemed to tighten its grip, filling the room with its quiet insistence. It was not hostile, not overtly threatening, but it was inescapable, and its patience made it far more terrifying than any sudden action could be. Time stretched slowly, elongated by the oppressive stillness. My eyelids grew heavier, my body sinking into the mattress, but my mind remained alert, attuned to every subtle change in the room. The curtain loomed large in the periphery of vision, a dark, silent sentinel. I realized then that the terror of this presence did not lie in sight or sound, but in patient observation. The awareness didn't need to act. Its mere presence, waiting, observing, unblinking, was enough. And as the edges of sleep finally began to touch me, the knowledge settled deep in my consciousness. The curtain held something behind it, something eternal, silent, and always watching, regardless of whether I opened my eyes or not. As the night pressed on, the quiet of the room deepened into something almost tangible. The air seemed thicker now, each inhalation carrying a subtle weight, and each exhalation a hesitant release. I lay there half awake, half drifting into sleep, but my mind refused to let go of the curtain. Its folds appeared heavier than ever, dark and still, yet charged with an awareness that made every nerve in my body alert. Shadows pooled in the creases of the fabric, stretching and curling, forming shapes my rational mind could not name. I imagined the faintest glimmer of eyes, unblinking, patient, observing me without movement, without sound, yet fully present. I tried to focus elsewhere, counting each breath, cataloging every sound in the room. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of the wind outside, but the awareness behind the curtain persisted. It was patient, silent, relentless. Each attempt to dismiss it, each rational thought, seemed only to draw more attention to its presence. The curtain became more than fabric. It became a threshold, a boundary between the familiar safety of my room and the unknown beyond. Every small shift of air, every subtle change in temperature seemed amplified, as if the very atmosphere was tuned to the presence lurking in that dark fold. Even the shadows on the walls seemed to move differently, stretching unnaturally, responding to my thoughts, my focus, my fear. I imagined them pooling into shapes, forms that were never fully realized, but suggested enough to make my imagination run wild. Each imagined movement was deliberate, patient, not meant to startle but to exist, to be acknowledged without effort. The tension in my body grew, my muscles taut, my chest tight, yet I lay still, trapped between the desire to look and the instinctive fear of seeing. My mind whispered that it was impossible, that the curtain was just fabric and shadows, yet the sensation persisted, curling into my awareness with the persistence of something alive. I shifted slightly, pulling the blanket closer, trying to convince myself I was safe, but even that small act did not diminish the presence. It was patient, a quiet observer, indifferent to my attempts at comfort. I imagined eyes behind the folds, too many to count, patient and unwavering. They didn't need to move. They didn't need to act. The stillness itself carried authority, a silent power that filled the room. Each sound in the space, the soft ticking, the faint hum, the occasional creak of the floorboards, seemed magnified, a subtle accompaniment to the awareness that lingered just beyond perception. Time seemed suspended, elongated by the oppressive stillness and my own heightened attention. Each second stretched, each heartbeat echoing like a soft drum in the quiet. My mind hovered between wakefulness and sleep, sensing without seeing, feeling without proof. The curtain remained motionless, yet the knowledge of what it concealed was enough to hold my thoughts captive. Even as sleep finally approached, the presence lingered, patient, silent, eternal. And in that liminal space, I understood a truth I could not name. The curtain was not empty. Whatever watched from behind it did so patiently, without need for motion, without sound, simply observing, always watching, always waiting, timeless and unblinking. The night had reached a depth that made the house feel like it existed outside of time. Every sound, every movement, every tiny shift of air was amplified in the heavy silence. I lay on my bed, eyes half closed, yet unable to ignore the ever-present curtain at the edge of the room. Its folds hung thick and dark, unmoving, but charged with an awareness that seemed to seep into my very bones. I tried to convince myself it was only imagination, that it was the effect of being alone in a house that creaked and moaned with age. But the rational voice in my mind was faint and fragile, drowned by the quiet insistence of the presence I felt pressing just beyond sight. I focused on my breathing, slow and deliberate, attempting to steady the pulse that had risen in my chest. Inhale, exhale, yet even as I counted each breath, I could feel the subtle pressure intensifying, curling around my consciousness. The curtain did not move, and yet I could feel it, patient, watching, entirely indifferent to my awareness. Shadows pooled in the folds, stretching in ways that defied logic, curling into shapes that almost, but never quite, formed something tangible. I imagined eyes, countless, unblinking, observing every flicker of thought, every twitch of muscle, without urgency, without need. Their patience made them more terrifying than any sudden threat could ever be. Each creak of the house, each faint rustle of wind against the window pane, seemed to echo louder in the thick stillness, drawing my mind again and again toward the curtain. I tried to divert my attention, focusing on the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, even the faint shadows moving on the ceiling. But every distraction only reminded me of the awareness I could not shake. The curtain loomed larger in my imagination with each passing moment, its folds dense, heavy, alive in ways I could not rationally explain. It felt as though it had always been there, waiting for this very moment, this very night, this very breath of mine. I shifted slightly beneath the blanket, curling inward in a futile attempt to protect myself, and yet the awareness remained patient and unyielding. I imagined the eyes behind the folds, not angry, not malicious, but intent, patient, observing. They did not blink, did not move, but existed in a way that made sleep an uneasy companion. Even closing my eyes did not release me from their gaze. In the darkness behind my lids, I could feel the presence stretching across the room, filling the space, coiling around my awareness like smoke. I realized then that what I feared most was not seeing movement, not hearing sound, but the knowledge that the unseen could exist perfectly content with just observing. Time became distorted, elongated by the oppressive stillness and my own heightened awareness. Each second stretched, each breath measured, each heartbeat echoing softly in the quiet. The curtain at the far end of the room became not just a piece of fabric, but a threshold to something far older and more patient than I could comprehend. My imagination painted images, shapes forming and dissolving, shadows stretching into impossible curves, and the faint, unblinking eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I shifted. I realized that sleep itself was now a temporary respite, a fragile illusion that allowed me to rest while the unseen watched. I tried to comfort myself, repeating in my mind that it was only imagination, only shadows, only a trick of fatigue. But the awareness did not diminish. It persisted, patient, silent, eternal, pressing lightly on my consciousness in a way that was impossible to ignore. I imagined attention focusing on every twitch of my eyelids, every shallow breath, every tiny movement, the room, the curtain, the silence, All of it existed in a delicate tension, and I was acutely aware of every detail, every sensation, every shadow, every heartbeat. As sleep slowly approached, I felt my awareness stretch into corners of the room. The curtain remained motionless, yet fully present, fully alive, fully watching. Its presence did not need to act. The mere knowledge of it, patient and eternal, was enough to dominate my senses. And as the night carried on, I surrendered to a reluctant slumber, aware that behind that heavy, dark curtain, something remained, silent, unblinking, patient, eternal, and always watching. Even in dreams, I could feel it, a weight on my consciousness that would not release until night ended and the first light of dawn threatened the edges of the darkness. The final hours of the night felt suspended, stretched thin by the weight of silence. Every sound, the soft tick of clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of wind brushing past the window, seemed magnified in the darkness, echoing against the walls and the heavy folds of the curtain. I lay still, trying to let my breathing slow, to trick my mind into believing I was safe. But the awareness never left. It pressed lightly against the edges of my thoughts, patient, unblinking, existing in the shadows without movement or sound, yet utterly alive. I imagined the folds of the curtain shifting imperceptibly, stretching the darkness into shapes my mind could almost see but never fully define. Eyes, countless and patient, unblinking and watching, seemed to linger just beyond perception. My heart beat steadily, but every pulse was accompanied by the subtle, creeping sensation that whatever was behind the curtain knew I was aware of it. Sleep came slowly, reluctantly, each wave of unconsciousness tempered by the quiet presence that refused to release me. Even as I closed my eyes fully, I could feel it there, patient, silent, eternal, an invisible sentinel holding vigil over the room. And then, as the first faint hints of morning light began to filter through the edges of the curtains, the tension in the room shifted ever so slightly. The darkness behind the folds remained, but it no longer felt immediate. It had receded just enough to allow a fragile sense of rest. I drifted deeper into sleep, carrying with me the memory of its silent vigilance, knowing it would wait patiently for the next night, the next breath, the next moment of vulnerability. The house remained still, the air thick with anticipation, the curtain unmoving and yet impossibly alive. And somewhere in that quiet, I knew the night was not over. Not really. Whatever had been watching, whatever had been patient, would return. Always, waiting for the next opportunity to make itself known in ways subtle, yet impossible to ignore. With the faint light of dawn settling in the room, I finally allowed myself a long, slow exhale, knowing the quiet presence will remain behind the curtain, patient and eternal. And as I drifted fully into the fragile comfort of sleep, I felt the first hint of tomorrow's tension in my chest, a reminder that the watching never truly ends. The following night brought a new kind of stillness. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of the previous nights, but something subtler, almost deceptive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Each creak of the floorboard seemed sharper, deliberate, echoing through the hallways like a muted warning. I lay on my bed, staring at the familiar curtain, and immediately felt the weight of anticipation pressing down. The folds, thick and dark, hung heavier than ever before, seeming almost sentient, each shadow curling into itself as though hiding something just beyond perception. My chest tightened instinctively, and my breaths became slow and deliberate, a rhythm I hoped would steady me, though deep down I knew it would not. The curtain seemed to occupy more space in the room than its physical presence allowed. Shadows stretched along the walls, subtle at first, then growing longer, shifting imperceptibly, just at the edge of vision. I forced my eyes away, attempting to focus on the ceiling, the floor, anything else, but my mind kept returning to the folds of the curtain. I imagined shapes behind it, impossible forms that flickered in and out of awareness, never fully taking shape, but always hinted at. The sensation of being watched, patient and unblinking, wrapped around me like a dense fog. My heart beat steadily, but each pulse seemed to echo, magnifying the awareness I felt, stretching it further into the corners of the room. Even the air itself seemed different tonight. Each inhalation carried a subtle weight, pressing against my lungs, as if the room had grown heavier while I slept. The silence was no longer empty. It had become charged, alive with the sense that the darkness behind the curtain was not passive. I imagined eyes, countless and unblinking, observing every movement I made, every flicker of thought, patient and deliberate. My rational mind whispered that it was only imagination, that fatigue and isolation had twisted the shadows into forms my consciousness could mistake for awareness. Yet every instinct in my body rebelled against this reassurance. I could feel it, patient, eternal, just beyond the folds, waiting. The longer I lay there, the more subtle movements of the room became amplified in my mind. The gentle hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the occasional creak of the walls settling. Each sound seemed to sync with the pulse in my chest, drawing my attention back to the curtain, back to the folds, back to the impossible awareness behind them. I imagined the shadows pooling, curling into shapes that stretched farther than physics should allow, twisting and turning in patterns that tease the edges of perception. The more I tried to focus elsewhere, the more the room seemed to respond, as though the very fabric of the space had become attuned to my thoughts, to my fear. I shifted slightly on the blanket, attempting comfort, yet the awareness remained undisturbed. The curtain loomed at the edge of vision, more than just fabric now. It was a threshold, a barrier between the familiar safety of my room and the unknowable presence beyond. My imagination conjured fleeting glimpses of forms behind the folds, stretching impossibly, curling, twisting, never fully revealed, yet fully acknowledged in the quiet insistence pressing against my mind. The awareness did not need to move or make sound. Its patient observation alone was enough to dominate the space, to make every heartbeat, every breath, every twitch of a muscle feel magnified and vulnerable. Time stretched and warped as I lay there, caught between wakefulness and sleep. Every second seemed drawn out, each moment a fragile thread connecting my mind to the presence beyond the curtain. I imagined it waiting, patient and eternal, observing without urgency, knowing I could not escape its attention even if I closed my eyes. Shadows pooled more densely, stretching further along the walls and floor, teasing shapes that my mind wanted to recognize but could never fully name. Sleep teased me like a distant, fragile promise, yet I could not surrender fully, not while the folds of the curtain held that impossible vigilance. Finally, as the night seemed infinite, I allowed my mind to wander along the edges of awareness, accepting the subtle pressure as part of the room itself. The curtain remained still, yet alive in a way that defied understanding. I imagined countless eyes, patient, unblinking, always observing, yet not hostile, simply present. The room had become a quiet organism, every shadow, every fold, every tiny sound intertwined with a sense of awareness. My breathing slowed, each inhale and exhale measured, a rhythm to match the patient, eternal presence. And even as sleep finally crept closer, the knowledge lingered unshakable. The curtain had always been alive in its own quiet way, always watching, always waiting, stretching across the room and into my mind, patient and eternal. The room seemed different tonight, though I could not quite place why. The air hung heavier than usual, dense with an almost tangible tension that pressed gently against my skin. Every shadow felt longer, deeper, curling into corners of the room where darkness should not linger. I lay on the bed, staring once more at the curtain, and the feeling of being watched returned stronger than before. Its folds were thick, darker than the dim moonlight allowed, and the shadows pooled in them like liquid, moving subtly in ways my mind could not explain. I could not bring myself to look directly at them, yet the knowledge of their presence pressed insistently into my awareness, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Each sound in the room seemed amplified, sharper, more deliberate. The ticking of the clock became a distant drum, echoing in time with my heartbeat. The faint hum of the refrigerator stretched through the room like a low vibration, and even the occasional creak of the floorboards took on an unfamiliar deliberateness, as though the house itself had become aware of my fear. I tried to focus on these mundane sounds, counting each one, assigning them to logical causes, but the presence behind the curtain persisted, patient and indifferent, unaffected by my attempts to rationalize. The silence between these noises was alive, filled with expectation and observation. My imagination, pushed to its limits by the oppressive quiet, began to create impossible forms. Shadows pooled in ways that defied physics, curling and stretching into shapes that tease the edge of recognition. I imagined countless eyes blinking slowly, unblinking, patient, observing me without movement or sound. The curtain became not just a piece of fabric, but a threshold of something sentient, a boundary between my small, fragile sense of safety and an awareness that had existed far longer than I had. I felt the room itself reacting to my focus, stretching and contracting subtly, as if attuned to my gaze, my heartbeat, my breath. Every attempt to distract myself failed. I shifted under the blanket, curled into familiar folds, tried to breathe slower, tried to convince myself it was only imagination, only shadows, only fatigue. But the awareness pressed on, patient and persistent. I felt its gaze in my chest, in the corners of my vision, even behind closed eyes. The longer I lay there, the more I realized that the presence did not need act to dominate the space. Its patience alone was terrifying, an eternal, silent observation that made the room feel alive in a way nothing else could. Time seemed to stretch and distort, each second lingering longer than the last. I counted my breaths, trying to anchor myself to reality, yet the awareness behind the curtain grew only stronger. Shadows pooled at the edges of the folds, forming and dissolving into shapes my mind could not name. Every subtle shift of air, every faint movement in the darkness, seemed magnified, as though the room itself were exaggerating the presence that had taken hold. The patient, unblinking gaze behind the curtain was everywhere and nowhere at once, entwined with the very essence of the room. I lay there, suspended between wakefulness and the fragile pull of sleep. Each heartbeat echoed in the thick silence, reminding me of my vulnerability. The curtain loomed larger in my mind, its folds dark and deep, holding shapes that were suggested but never fully revealed. I imagined eyes watching patiently, observing every twitch, every exhale, every thought. The presence behind the fabric did not rush, did not threaten, yet it dominated my senses entirely. Its stillness carried more weight than any movement, more terror than any sound. Finally, as I began to drift into the shallow edge of slumber, I accepted the quiet pressure as a part of the room itself. The folds of the curtain were no longer just fabric. They were a conduit, a portal to awareness that could exist without action, without sound, without form. The room, the shadows, the faintest of creaks, all became extensions of that silent vigilance. And as sleep finally claimed me, I carried with me the undeniable certainty that whatever watched from behind the curtain was patient, eternal, unblinking, and entirely indifferent to my presence. Its waiting was timeless, and I was merely one of many nights it would observe, quietly, endlessly, patiently. By the middle of the night, the room had transformed into a place that seemed to exist outside of time. Every creak, every hum, every whisper of air carried a significance I could feel deep in my chest. The curtain at the far end of the room dominated my vision, its folds thick and dark, impossibly heavy, yet unmoving. Shadows pooled within them, curling and stretching in ways my mind could not fully comprehend. I lay on my bed, attempting to remain still, my breath slow and measured, try to convince myself that it was only imagination. But deep down, I knew the presence behind that fabric was real, patient, silent, eternal. I focused on each sound in the room, cataloging them, trying to convince myself that the ticking clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the subtle creaks of the floorboards were harmless. But every noise seemed amplified, each one drawing my attention back to the curtain, back to folds that seemed impossibly dark, impossibly deep. Shadows twisted and pooled, stretching beyond logical understanding, and my mind began to fill in the spaces. I imagined countless eyes, unblinking, patient, observing every twitch of my muscles, every shallow breath, every thought racing through my mind. Their gaze was not angry or hostile. It was simply there, infinite and eternal, requiring nothing from me except recognition. Even the air itself felt alive tonight, thick with awareness. Each inhalation carried weight, each exhalation pressed softly into my chest. The room seemed to expand and contract subtly, attuned to my focus, as if the unseen presence behind the curtain was aware of my attempts to rationalize it away. My muscles tensed, my heart beat faster, and yet I remained frozen in place, paralyzed by the patient insistence of what lurked beyond perception. It did not need to move. It did not need to act. Its quiet observation alone dominated the room, the darkness, my thoughts, and my awareness entirely. I tried to shift under the blanket, curling slightly, attempting to create some sense of safety, but the presence did not waver. The folds of the curtain became more than fabric. They were a threshold, a silent boundary between my fragile sense of security and the unknowable vigilance beyond. My imagination, already frayed by the way of the night, conjured fleeting, impossible shapes, shadows stretching in ways they should not, curling into forms my mind could almost name, but never fully. And always behind those folds, the awareness remained patient, silent, unblinking, and completely indifferent to my fear. Time stretched on indefinitely. Every heartbeat echoed in the stillness, every second exaggerated by my own heightened senses. The shadows seemed to pulse in rhythm with me, growing denser, curling further along the walls and floor. The curtain was no longer just a curtain. It had become the axis of the room, the anchor for an impossible vigilance. The imagined eyes multiplied, yet remained patient and unblinking. I realized that the true terror of this presence was not in movement, not in sound, but in the simple, eternal act of watching. And as sleep edged closer, I surrendered reluctantly, carrying the undeniable knowledge that whatever existed behind that curtain was eternal, patient, and unyielding. Even as I drifted toward unconsciousness, the awareness stretched across the room, filling every corner, extending into my mind, coiling around my consciousness like smoke. The shadows pooled and twisted, silent, impossible, eternal, and the curtain remained still yet alive, a dark, unblinking sentinel. And I knew with absolute certainty that the watching would continue, night after night, patient, silent, eternal, indifferent to my presence, waiting for the next moment, the next breath, the next heartbeat. The night had grown heavier now, the kind of stillness that presses into your bones and settles in your chest. The house itself seemed alive, each creak of the floorboards deliberate, each faint sigh of wind brushing against the window, carrying weight. I lay on my bed, unable to tear my gaze from the curtain, its folds thick, dark, and impossibly dense. Shadows pooled in the fabric, curling and stretching in ways that defied logic. Every instinct in my body screamed to look away, to close my eyes, to retreat under the blanket. Yet some deeper part of me, the part that was both terrified and compelled, remained fixed, aware, and fully attentive. The curtain felt heavier tonight, charged with the same awareness I had felt on nights before, but somehow amplified. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my consciousness, coiling softly around the edges of my mind. Shadows twisted in the folds, appearing and disappearing, teasing impossible forms that seemed to flicker just beyond recognition. I imagined countless eyes, patient, unblinking, watching me with the same patience that had haunted me all these nights. They did not need to act. They did not need to make a sound. And yet the presence was undeniable, occupying the entire room without movement. Every sound in the room became magnified, each one a reminder of my own vulnerability. The ticking clock echoed in my chest like a muted drum. The faint hum of the refrigerator became a low vibration that seemed to resonate with the floorboards, and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees outside seemed deliberate, synchronized with the pulse of my heartbeat. I tried to catalog these noises, naming each one to anchor myself to reality, but the awareness behind the curtain persisted, patient and indifferent, expanding through the room, into the shadows and into my thoughts. Even my own breathing seemed to echo unnaturally in the thick silence, reminding me that I was entirely exposed to this invisible vigilance. I imagined the shadows pooling, curling, and stretching across the room, forming shapes my mind could almost grasp but never fully identify. I felt the presence observing every twitch of muscle, every shallow breath, every flicker of thought. It did not need to act. Simply existing, simply watching, was enough to dominate the space. My imagination, stretched to its limits by fear and exhaustion, conjured fleeting visions of impossible forms behind the curtain. Figures that bent in unnatural ways, shadows that seemed to reach toward me and then withdraw without movement, eyes that glimmered faintly and remained patient, unblinking, eternal. Time slowed to an unbearable crawl. Every second stretched, every heartbeat thundered in the quiet, and I became acutely aware of the relentless patience of presence. I could feel it as a weight on my chest, a subtle pressure at the back of my mind, stretching through the room in ways I could not see. The curtain was no longer just fabric. It was a threshold, a boundary, a conduit for something ancient and enduring. My body tensed, yet I lay frozen, unable to act, unable to flee, knowing that any movement might provoke it, or perhaps knowing that nothing would matter to it at all. The shadows seemed to grow darker, pooling along the edges of the walls, creeping along the floor, stretching impossibly toward the corners of the ceiling. I imagined the unseen presence behind the curtain counting my breaths with me, watching each flicker of fear, each involuntary movement. The awareness was patient, eternal, and unyielding, perfectly content to exist in stillness, while I suffered the full weight of my own imagination. Sleep teased me, approaching in slow, delicate waves, yet I could not surrender fully. The presence demanded recognition simply by existing. Even as the night dragged on, the curtain remained motionless, yet I could feel the invisible eyes following, patient and unblinking. Shadows pooled deeper, stretching further, and the air grew thick with anticipation, as though every molecule in the room were charged with its quiet attention. My muscles burned with tension, my chest felt tight, and every tiny sound, the tick of the clock, the distant hum, the sigh of the wind, was a reminder that the presence was still there, still watching and entirely indifferent to my awareness. The curtain's stillness carried authority. Its silence carried power. I realized that terror was no longer in motion or sound. It was in patient observation, and an impossible knowledge that the unseen had always been there. As dawn approached, a faint glow crept along the edges of the curtain, yet it did nothing to diminish the presence. It remained patient, eternal, unblinking, a quiet sentinel occupying every corner of the room, every shadow, every breath I drew. I surrendered reluctantly to the shallow grasp of sleep, knowing that even in unconsciousness, the awareness would persist, stretching through the room, coiling around my mind, patient and eternal. And as my eyes finally drifted fully closed, I understood something deeply unsettling. The night was never truly over, and whatever lay behind the curtain would wait patiently for the next one, silent, unblinking, eternal, and utterly indifferent.